artist, everybody. Hi, Joe. It's nice to see you again. Hi, everybody. Hello, students. Hello, external guests. Hello, staff. Hello, faculty. Hello, students. Hello, everybody. Kristian kind of needs no introduction because he's sort of a part of Webster. He's kind of, well, he is a part of the Webster family, I should say. And but for those of you who don't know him, he's a Norwegian photojournalist, but so much more. I just found out at lunch. So I was speaking to him and I was like, "You're a photojournalist," and he's like, "Yes, but." So there's a whole, very diverse story to him and what he does. And he is now based in Sarajevo after having lived in Switzerland for quite some time. And he's going to tell us about what life is like over there. And what he does is he works on the topic of life after war, life after genocide, and other things as well. And we're very happy to have you, Kristian. Thank you so much for coming and being a part of this lecture series, and welcome again.
Thank you. Yes, so I probably know most of you, and many of you have seen my previous presentations I've done here. So I'll diversify a little bit for that because the title is Meet the Artist. I'm troubled by the title, of course, because I'm not an artist. I'm a pure and simple documentary photographer. That's how I see myself. And then we can maybe discuss a little bit what that means and where that comes from and what photography is in the context of art, perhaps. But given that title, I was thinking back a little bit because I did study art during my undergrad years. And I had a very good professor when I did my postgraduate studies, Ian Jeffrey at Goldsmith College, University of London. And he spoke about topics that interested me. He spoke about, if you work in imagery, he spoke about where motivation comes from, other kind of artistic fields that might interest somebody doing photography. And so this is my opening picture of a current project that I will refer back to later on. But one guy that I got introduced to is someone that at least Tim knows about, and maybe Francesco, but Storaro. So if you make film and you use gels in front of your light sources, you have these kinds of lights and you have gelatin in front, you can buy leaf filters, you can buy Roscoe gels, and you can buy the Storaro collection. Do you know this guy, Tim? Yeah. So Storaro comes from Vittorio Storaro, which is a cinematographer. I think he's a pretty good cinematographer. He worked with great filmmakers like Francis Ford Coppola. He works with Bertolucci. He works with all kinds of other filmmakers. And he would only accept projects if he was allowed to film the project the way he wanted to film it. So he needed to be very much indebted into the project. And plenty of people agreed to that, and that's why he made Last Tango in Paris. This is why he made Apocalypse Now, for example, Dick Tracy, and other movies. I thought he was interesting because this guy is someone who specifically refers to great artists around when he works. Here are some of the. This is from Last Tango in Paris when he was shooting that, and he made an interesting movie. There was an interesting interview with him about his preparation for this film, because he brought the entire crew to Paris. This was in the early 70s. The film is from 72, I believe, and he was looking around, scouting for a place where he would film this movie. And he was stuck. He couldn't find the location. He couldn't find the setting, and he didn't know what to do. But there was a huge exhibition of Francis Bacon at the time in Paris. So he brought the entire crew there, and he looked at his paintings. And they spent the afternoon there. You can see there are similarities. He said to the crew afterwards, and we can go home now because I know exactly where we're going to shoot. I know exactly how we're going to film it, and we're finished. And this is how we got inspiration. This is how Last Tango in Paris was put together, visually speaking. He did similar studies looking at other artwork with all of his movies. And I think this is kind of interesting. So the nearest thing to meet the artist would be that, yeah, it's easy to take reference and take inspiration from other artistic people working. And Apocalypse Now, I think, is also a very interesting movie because it's a movie that deals with so many different sub-stories within one story. And this is something that Storaro describes very well in a book where he writes about the different storylines happening simultaneously throughout the entire movie, and each storyline is lit differently in order to be identified. So if you pay attention to the movie, you will start to see these sub-stories based on his lighting. And I thought, this is not a bad thing. This is an interesting thing, an interesting way of working. Of course, I had to use this picture just in his lecture about the crazy photographer with no film in a camera. When I've done talks here in the past, I normally talk about my long-term project about life after genocide. So over the last 10 years, I've been working a lot in Bosnia, I worked in Rwanda, and more recently in Iraq. And this is about, it's about understanding how people can pick up the pieces and restart their lives after having gone through something horrific. It's a story in a sort of documentary context that I think is important, because I think it's a topic which is not being explored perhaps enough. I think it's something that's easy to forget sometimes. It's fairly calm now in Aleppo, but we don't hear much more about it, although it was on news 24/7 for a long time until recently. So these kinds of things I think is important. But if you're a photojournalist, you also have to find ways of making a living, because those two things doesn't always work together. So as a photographer, I work with many different kinds of organizations, companies, NGOs, and other organizations too. You don't see very much here, actually. But anyway, this is a guy looking into a microscope. So I work in many fields. I work a lot with research companies, medical and food and all kinds of different things. And I'm trying to work with that in a documentarian way as well. So if I work with a company, I try to figure out what they're working on, and I would typically work with them in terms of documenting how an organization functions, for example. So if a company makes an annual report, they sometimes will call me and say, we want to document what we do in order to use in our reporting. In many ways, it's very similar to journalistic work. And it's true, Vittorio Storaro was an inspiration too in terms of how I use light. It needs to be a lot darker in order to see this properly, but anyway, you got to take my word for it. So this is the kind of stuff that you wouldn't necessarily have seen amongst my work in the past. This is a research plant where they're testing how to produce food. But again, visually speaking, the techniques and the ways of working is very similar. It's very direct, it's very in your face. Here you have very few colors. You're working on making sure that you can see what is important here. In this case, the brain of a mouse. It's important, it stands out from the liquid stuff which it is inside. Coffee plants, coffee beans, parties. This is not an important picture, but it's a picture that stands out in terms of how the lighting works, how the composition works. If you knew the subtitle, it would be more interesting, because there's Lewis Hamilton in the picture. I photograph people too, sometimes, and animals. Very straightforward. Surgery. This is an important story about a company who's producing tissue material to help healing in people. When you do surgery, or brain surgery, or hand surgery, you protect, for example, nerves. You protect, for example, the wound that you create by doing surgery. You do whatever you need to do. You patch thing up again, and afterwards you will have to do a second surgery in order to remove certain things that you have placed there. This company is producing material that will automatically disintegrate on its own, so you don't need a second surgery. This is for an NGO, for the Aga Khan Foundation. Again, very simple use of color. But in terms of the slightly more in-depth work of things, I was thinking back in terms of sort of real artists, how they were working. And I think one photographer that I appreciated from quite early age was a guy called Morten Krogvold. So unless you know Norwegian, you wouldn't be able to pronounce his name, but he's a very talented photographer. This is a portrait of a painter called Frans Wiedeberg. He's a great painter. But the story of him that I appreciate the most was probably he explained the process he went through when he was going to photograph a musician, Luciano Pavarotti. He was going to go to Italy and photograph this guy. So he said that in order to make this picture of him, he had to understand how this guy functioned. So he had to do enough research to feel that he know this guy. So what he did, he spent a few weeks listening to all his music. He spoke to him on a couple of occasions. He wanted to understand what he liked eating, what he liked drinking, how his family was, and all that kind of stuff. He said, we both like red wine, so I probably finished a truckload of red wine, but it was very good because I understood this guy very well afterwards. I couldn't find a picture online of this one photograph. I have it in a book, but the book was too big to bring here. And you have Luciano Pavarotti in a hammock, so I thought that was a good example of understanding how he functions. But I always thought about that if you go into a topic, you got to know about that topic before you go into it. So this is a friend of mine. We had a little roundtable discussion this morning, and this is the first person I met on one of my trips to Rwanda, John. He's a former Webster student, Webster St. Louis student. He survived the genocide in Rwanda. His little brother, his mother, father, his grandmother, uncle and aunt did not survive, but he was my first entry point to go into this place. When it comes to composition again, I think it's in a documentary way, you got to make things as simple as possible. You want to be able to read the photograph fast to understand. So some of you know the story of Srebrenica in Bosnia very well, some of you don't probably. In a very simple way, the UN failed to protect this place, and a genocide was allowed to happen. This is from about 2 years ago, and I think it explains this situation quite well. This was part of an exhibition this year, in fact, that was meant to be shown at the European Union Parliament, about 11 lessons from Srebrenica, and it was shown as part of an interview with one guy, and so it was a portrait, and it was this picture. And the European Parliament had agreed to the exhibition, and in the end it never happened because it was too confrontational.
Kristian, did you set up the umbrella or was it there?
It was there. So this is from the commemoration on July 11th, and anyone who visits Srebrenica on July 11th, in most cases, at least 9 out of 10 times, it's going to be boiling hot. So this is somebody using an umbrella to protect himself from the sun. And it's a main memorial cemetery there. So this is from the 20th commemoration, and during the little roundtable we had earlier on today, we're talking about this location here. This is a place called Bisesero. It's maybe 4 or 5 hours away from Kigali, near the border to Congo. And it was a place where 50,000 people were killed. Here, people were having the 20th commemoration. So this is 7th of July, 2014. And there was a handful of people there. There was these guys and a few others. There was 10, 15 people there. During the day when the commemoration had been going on and they had speakers, from what Kigali was talking about in Kigali, there were maybe, I would say, 100 people in total there in this little village. And this is the place where 50,000 were killed beforehand. So it was a harsh contrast in terms of what had happened then and what was going on there now. Very few people survived at all. There's one person in Geneva who comes from Bisesero that I spent some time with here. He managed to leave and get out of the country and is now living his life here in Geneva. He's at the University of Geneva. So it was a very strange feeling because we also knew that we had limited time there, but it was quite an intimate feeling to be there with these people. again, the same thing here. This is spending time with my friend John, who you saw in an earlier picture, walking back to his place in the evening. So this guy, after graduating from Webster in St. Louis, he went back to Rwanda. This is now about 5 years ago. He tried to set up his own company, a little coffee shop or tea room. That didn't work very well. So he's been trying to, he's done this like 3 times now, I think, trying to set up his own company. Continues to look for work. He cannot get any work. But every single day, he wakes up in the morning, he goes to the local library, and he reads. He reads, he applies for grants, he applies for possibilities to live abroad, every single day still, after all these years. So this is walking back with him, spending time with him. It's part of his everyday life. This picture here is not necessarily that important. It's an overall location picture of a street in a place called Kabuga. Kabuga is a suburban area of Kigali. John's tea room is behind his bikers here. And it's the only time ever that I was confronted with anything not so nice photographing. Because it's a relatively poor neighborhood, not a bad neighborhood. But I walked around there photographing, and you know, if you travel and you photograph in a journalistic capacity, you need a journalism visa in Rwanda. And Rwanda is not known for being fantastic when it comes to press freedom, but there's no problem photographing there. You have the right to do so. And I know the guys from the Rwandan mission here. It's a great office. They've been here a couple of times in the past as well. So I applied for the journalism visa, and I had that with me. I asked if there were any things. You cannot photograph police there, or military, of course, which is quite normal anyway. But when I took this picture, I turned around, there were 6 guys pointing a gun at me. Uncertainty. And they were a little bit surprised that the guy running the more popular tea room on the high street was my friend. So as long as I was there, I was allowed to stay. But they told me to leave. I still don't know why. I know that I didn't photograph them. I had photographed the police and the military, but not there. But they didn't notice it. It's another picture which for me is very important because, I mean, compositionally, in terms of documentary, I think it's important to, as you've seen by now, to sort of be on the location, to meet people where they are, where they work, and to understand how they function. So this is Regine. She survived the genocide. She's original. Well, today in Rwanda you don't say Hutu or Tutsi, you say Rwandan, but she's ethnically Tutsi. If you ask her, she's HIV positive. She's got 2 twin daughters, and her husband at the time was ethnically Hutu. And while she was pregnant during the genocide, he tried to kill her. So she was hiding away behind their house. So I came inside her little kind of mud house, and she showed me how she protected the windows with wood, because this is 20 years after the genocide, but she's still being taken by, you know, people are coming to bother her, they're intimidating her, they're making life very complicated for her. So I thought it was good to go with her to see where this is, and this is all, of course, while you're sort of also trying to work. You have to work with a translator. I mean, I had to do that because I don't speak here in Rwanda. But still, you try to understand and be as close as you can to them. Again, it's also about using light, of course. It's a bit complicated. You're not going to work in a studio. You don't have studio equipment with you. You try to make it as simple as possible with as little equipment as possible too. This is walking into these kind of secret tunnels with no light, of course, so it's convenient to have a mobile phone with you. This is in Sinjar, so these are ISIS tunnels. This is in the tea room of John again, trying to kind of he had to close down his shop, so he was making a new one. And there we were trying to see how this new shop room is going to be like. It's a very, very simple thing. I mean, it's a dirt floor with some benches, and he had some old furniture that he tried to work with. Using lights, using the streets, trying to lead into the photograph. Using natural light. Looking for details too, and also looking for, when you work in different rooms, when you work in different locations, you don't see, on an automatic camera today, or any digital camera today, you work with different light levels, different colors of light. And this is also, I guess, something I'm trying to work on myself, to allow the colors to be whatever they are. In here we have interior lighting, which is different than exterior lighting, so the colors, so pictures will appear yellow, they will appear blue typically. So that's often warm or cold, and I think that's important to use in the same way. I mean, this is typically the way Storaro would work. He would try to let the color help tell that story. So this is artificial lighting. So this woman holding the picture of her nephew in her hand, it was important to show exactly how it was on that scene. It looks technically wrong, but still it's important that it's like that. And it's exactly the same. So this is on location in a refugee camp. And this is, of course, in a research center. So the idea is exactly the same, to try to use the colors, how it's been set up, and to intensify that. It's crazy. So this guy here had to sit inside that machine for 7 hours and relax. His job was to relax the entire day. And they were monitoring his pulse and everything. This is important too, because this is from the same series as where the 50,000 people were killed. This is Lake Kivu and Congo in the background. You have this road leading out of this little village area, and you can see the terrain here. You see a few houses around, but not a lot. So it's a very sort of rural area. Most documentary pictures should have a caption though, and there's a caption with this picture too. This is the son of the guy who led the resistance against the genociders when it first happened. His father is now passed away, but I mean, he's the one who started to try to stop those 50,000 killings. And it's important for that because you see the terrain, you need an overall picture. And they managed to resist longer than anyone else in Rwanda. I like texture a lot too. I like to try to make things quite graphic, because I think it's easy to read. I think it tells the message well. This picture here is an important picture for me. It was one of the first pictures when I went to Rwanda for the commemoration from, I think this is from 2011. And I felt that there was a lot of solidarity. I think Joe was there too on that trip. There was a lot of solidarity amongst people, and it was a particularly large burial. So to explain the commemoration a little bit in Bosnia, the preparations for that starts a few days before the actual commemorating day, which is the 11th of July. There's a large peace march that takes place between the city where the people tried to escape to during the war to come to safety, and that peace march goes all the way back to Srebrenica. It takes 3 days. On July 10th, the coffins of the people who've been identified since the last year arrives to the commemoration location. They're still identifying people today from the murders in Srebrenica. So this still happens today. In 2011, there was over 600 people being buried. And I had never seen that many coffins in my life lined up. I mean, I guess most of us haven't. So when you come into this room full of these coffins in an old warehouse, and then you realize that there were no real organization between getting those coffins from this warehouse out to the cemetery where the burial were going to happen. So you have this big line of men coming together, starting to lift these coffins up, and then you see this big kind of, it's like a snake almost that goes out, and you see all these coffins being laid out in a memorial cemetery, which was quite amazing to see. You don't see that anymore like that because the numbers are much less. I mean, this was one of the years they buried the most victims. And I had done a lot of reading and trying to understand how this functions in the past, so I had seen a lot of photographs as well, and trying not to repeat the same picture. And I thought that in a way, these people that were helping were sort of neutral people. They were just showing solidarity for the whole thing. So to try to show these guys without showing who they were in a way, but just this help happening, I thought that was one way of trying to make that happen. So the guys didn't move, but the coffins moved, and you have all these coffins being transferred. And this is, they're moving the coffins about, I would say it's about 300-400 meters maybe. So you have a big line of people lined up. But so you see composition quite similar but very differently. So whether you're doing corporate work, research work, or documentary work, it works in the same way. This is part of that surgery series I was talking about earlier on. This is the woman who had surgery. Reminded me a bit of the same guy. This is from that peace walk leading up to the commemoration in Bosnia. I never did get his name though. Oftentimes windows and mirrors and all that kind of stuff is something which is interesting to work on too. And I like the idea of having the inside and the outside in one picture because it shows different levels of a certain situation. This picture is a very simple picture. It's just a picture from a bar, but you have a mirror on the screen, so you look like you don't quite know where you are, if you're inside or outside. Of course, as a photographer, typically you shouldn't photograph towards the window because we have light problems here. At the same time, it can help you to show a bit behind the scene almost, you know. You don't necessarily see exactly what is important in this picture, but it does show the result of what happens in this place. This is at a hospital in Sinjar City after Sinjar City was rescued from ISIS. And there was base with Vicken, who teaches here too. We were the two of us there, and there were maybe 3 people in this hospital. It was almost empty. Everything was destroyed, but they had cleared the kitchen area, so they used that for not just for eating, but also for washing equipment, etc. So they took me to that area there. Again, visiting victims, although this was not Sinjar, this was another attack, but this is Ali showing the results of what happens in a genocide situation. He survived the Halabja attack in 1988 when Saddam gassed the people of Halabja to try his chemical weapons. I think around 5,000 people were killed, and he survived. He was 4 years old at the time. Exactly 1 year ago, so a year after this picture was taken, I received an email from his friend that he had passed away as a result of him having difficulties breathing after this attack. Another similar thing with windows, corporate picture. Using windows, I thought it framed the situation quite well. This guy was a strong character, he deserved a strong picture. Again, with windows. This is not John, this is someone else, and it's actually all of these are survivors of the Rwanda genocide, and the guy in the middle is a soldier that worked during the time and helped me a lot with the logistics in Rwanda. Theodore. Working on those post-war situations too, when you see children, it's tempting to photograph too. And also, here I was with a woman who had survived the genocide, but she was badly injured as an 11-year-old. And you know, when you're paralyzed, you cannot move, but you see the new children growing up. It's interesting to show the parallels too from then and what happened then and what's going on right now. You see those parallels. And this girl used to come in there every day. She came in constantly playing around this woman who was paralyzed. I liked it because of the windows here. So this guy's a lawyer. He worked with people who committed genocide and explained how the processes worked after, immediately after the genocide, and how people were working, how the authorities were working, and how they were trying to kind of find some kind of order in the country when they were lacking all kinds of different people, like judges, like lawyers, like courts, prison, etc. So he was part of that process, and he represented the people who committed genocide at this time. And then later on, worked on supporting how these people who had been in prison, how they could be released back into the communities, which is what happened in Rwanda. You see, these are the coffins again. These are the coffins, how they're being carried out. This is 2 years later. Slightly smaller burial. Again, windows. This was a small commemoration. You know, in Rwanda, when they're commemorating the genocide, it's a process that takes a long time. It goes on for 1 month. From April 7th, for 1 month they're commemorating. And there are plenty little commemoration ceremonies that goes on in different parts of the country. So this was not exactly on the 7th of April. This is maybe 2 weeks later. And it was a relatively small gathering, but it was still interesting to see how they're consumed into this process that happens. The whole community comes in, and everybody has some sort of position in the ceremony they're having. It's almost like they're celebrating something. From a compositional point of view, it's another one of those when you are inside and out, and how you're mixing colors to show two different worlds going on here. You have research on one side, and you have the regular stuff going on the other side, using the light to tell that story. So this is leading up to trying to use the composition to be part of the story. And here you have, it's obviously brutal what's going on there. And you're realizing how you can use texture to kind of intensify what's going on, cropping in on the photograph, showing only the sort of brutal reality of what's happening in front of you, or using a wider picture and using texture. And many times when I photograph, I think of this picture here of the Last Supper. That's talking about real artists sometimes. We have these, and I think it's interesting because we all know what's going on in this picture, but all these little sub-things happening amongst the groups of people. And the first time I really thought about that was the 20th commemoration in Srebrenica, because here with Bill Clinton in the middle, it looks almost like that picture for me. You have the different groups in the background. And then I looked at some of the other pictures that are groups that I photographed that has that. This is from Rwanda. This is from Iraq. This is from the United States. Yeah. Different groups in different ways. And then there's the last picture that well, not quite the last, but there's one picture that I wanted to talk about too, again for Rwanda. How do you know how to deal with shooting portraitures sometimes? Because portraits sometimes can be quite complicated, particularly if you don't have a lot of time to prepare yourself. And portraits should should tell something about the person you're photographing. Obviously, being Norwegian, I looked at all the Munch paintings, and he was always very direct with what he thought, and he tried to show a lot about himself in his own pictures. This is his self-portrait, and there was his bones at the bottom of the picture, etc. I thought about those pictures. I have an uncle who has a sketch of these two that I used to look at. In Norway, you can see many people have little sketches of Munch in charcoal. And then, when I met this guy here, I know that this picture is on the wall here somewhere. When I met this guy here, I realized this was a bit of a situation like that because it was very direct. This was a guy that I had very little time with, and I had called him and I wanted to photograph him. He wouldn't, and I thought I wondered if this guy wanted to be photographed or he will allow me to be photographed. Because he had committed genocide, he had killed a lot of people. He'd been in prison for 12 and a half years. I knew that in Bosnia I had tried to meet people who committed genocide and there's just no chance at all. It's very complicated. And in Rwanda I heard that maybe it would be a little bit easier. So through a translator we called him and I said, unfortunately we run out of time, but we have 15 minutes, but we don't have time to come to your place, which is never ideal when you're trying to document somebody's life. But can you come to our place? And he said, yes. I said, I'm a photographer, so I need to photograph you and I will write your story next to it. He said, that's fine. So he came on a moped taxi, and he came and we had asked a few questions. We had about 10 or so minutes and we could take this picture of him. And in a way, you know, in my book he got a little bit of credit too, because he allowed himself to be part of that story about what happened, and he allowed himself to be photographed. For me it's an important picture. Another direct picture, the previous CEO of Nestle. This is the first annual general meeting that he had with shareholders, and I like the fact that he was surrounded by this green background screen because he looked very new in his job, and he was very new in his job too. Now the different kind of a portrait, an environmental portrait. This guy Jean-Pierre, you see him just walking on the land where he had been when his village was attacked, and you don't see so much. You see him, but you don't see much of him, but you just see enough. You see his big scar in the head for what happened to him as a child. Another Rwandan survivor. This is where he lives now. He lives in Switzerland. So this is just showing the contrast of where he is in Rwanda and here in Switzerland. This is probably one of the most impactful people that I met in Bosnia, I think. Sadia Osmanovic is if you Google her name, you'll come across quite a lot of information. She's a very strong character. She lost both her boys and her husband, and she lives on her own. And this is outside of her house, and for me, this is the best picture I have of her. Because to show her, you can tell that she's a strong person. And this is her backyard. Now, this is in November, but a couple of years ago, 4 years ago. And her land goes all the way to the trees in the background, and this is her vegetable field, and this is that's where she produces her food for the year. And she's exactly like that. If you meet her, she'll be like that. She was invited to take part in the commemoration in London in 2015 for the 20th commemoration that was going to take place there. She was invited to the Prime Minister's office in Downing Street. She went there with a friend of mine who is also another survivor. So they went in there. So the Prime Minister's assistant came and said, you can sit on this chair here, and you know what? Barack Obama sat here the other day. So what? I'm famous too, she said. She didn't care at all. It's not important. I guess I like strong colors. That's what I wanted to show with this picture here. I like people to stand out on their own in their photographs. A lot. So the woman who I photographed she had protected a window with woods. This is her home. This is the home where she was in. This is where we were inside, and this is the field where she'd been hiding during the genocide behind her in the banana plantation there. So this is the last picture I want to sort of share now, and then I want us to have a bit of conversation. This is from last year's commemoration in Bosnia, and I think that this is kind of a well-structured, typical documentary photograph. Describes why I feel that I'm a photographer rather than an artist as such. Do you guys have any questions on what you've seen so far?
Can we clap for you first? I've got a lot of questions, but I'll save mine for the podcast, which I'm going to be recording in a few minutes. But I'm sure there's at least one question for the audience. We have about 10 minutes. Yeah.
These are all taken spontaneously. A few of them are staged, right?
A few of them are. I mean, most of the corporate ones are not staged, but they've been set up, yeah, to be part of it, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about to what extent, when you actually snap the picture, that you see the full range of metaphors and meanings? Because I see there's a primary meaning and a secondary meaning, and looking further, there's even deeper meaning. Do you see all that before you take the picture, or is it just you get a...
It's a good question, because, and I think it's an important aspect of what it means when you're trying to document anything. That's why it's important to be on location and be patient.
Mm-hmm.
Because if documentary photography is about creating relationships, it means you've got to be patient and take the time it takes. So you don't want to turn up at a commemoration just when the ceremony starts. You probably want to turn up a day or two ahead of that. So you get to know the location, you see what's going on there, you get to know the people a little bit, so that you can make anticipations about what's about to happen. And then you hang around a lot. So yeah, you're seeing things happening. You're looking for compositions for sure. So it's not been staged. But then again, what is staging? I mean, does the way you position yourself, is that part of being staged? So you look for, I certainly look for compositions, and then I know that something is going to happen within here, and probably something like this will happen, and you wait. So there's a lot of that happening, definitely.
Does it happen a lot that you see something but it's in action and you didn't get the picture off and you thought, oh, I missed a good one there?
Yeah, but I'm not going to talk to you about those. No, that happens, of course, yeah, definitely. Yeah. And also, what if it happens in the wrong place? You know, when you're a photographer or a filmmaker or whatever, you deal with light. If the light is crap over there, it's just not going to happen for you. Maybe you have no choice, maybe you still have to, but at the same time, there's no point wasting your time if it's never going to work, because in the end of the day, you're trying to create some kind of impact in terms of what you're doing. And if it looks crap, it's not going to work. So then you got to move on and then wait for something else to go on. Another related point about that is sometimes things happening because you're there with the camera.
Yeah.
And in a way, that happens too, I'm sure, sometimes. I have a picture from one of the commemorations that I've documented. And then I took a few steps back and I took a picture of that lady crying over the coffin, and there were about 20 photographers around her. I wonder if she would have cried like that if there were no photographers there. You know? So that happens too. But it's definitely about patience and taking your time and trying to understand the situation as good as you can and try to tell that the way that you feel is appropriate. I mean, that's basically what happens. But it's never, I don't stage. If you take a portrait, yeah, you tell maybe a person to sit or stand there sometimes. But beyond that, that wouldn't work.
Yeah, you had a question.
How do you tell their stories? Like, do you write in a journal or?
Repeat the question.
How do you tell the story?
Because all the photographies there about, they're part of the story about the people.
Yeah. So what I do now, so I started my photography in London. I moved here, and now I'm in Sarajevo. So now I'm focusing primarily on Bosnia, or the Balkans at least, mostly. So what I do now is I started kind of a new phase, because since I live in a place, I can spend even more time and have more relationships with more people. And I will do this in, broadly speaking, in a context of an oral history idea. It's something that we started here a long time ago together with WHA. But for many reasons, it had to stop. And I will do something similar to that. And that includes photography, video, and writing. I always anyway write a little bit, but oftentimes it's been rewritten by somebody who writes better than me. But I use information that I have. But I try to have it all, yeah. And in this country, my work sometimes has been used partially here. But my stories are available through Keystone, which is the larger photojournalistic agency in Switzerland. So they're available there too.
Who was first? Maureen, ladies first, one second.
What led you or motivated you to choose genocides, in fact, for your work? Is there any?
You have to blame troublemakers for that.
Joe is the source.
No, but
Not you, Joe.
once
The
upon a
other Joe.
time. So Joe once asked me to come along on a student trip in 2010 to document a bit the trip. That's what was going on. And I remembered Bosnia quite well. I was an undergrad student at the time in London, and I was curious about that. I couldn't go at the time, but I could come there a day later than that, so I did that. But because I was working, so I didn't have time to do what I would normally want to do before a trip, to do much reading. And I was confused. I didn't quite remember who was there and who did that or whatever. I realized nearly 10 years later that I still don't know that, because it's still equally confusing in Bosnia, sort of. So I understand it is confusing there. But after that trip, which was fairly sort of straightforward, I realized I wanted to go back again. And then, because there were so many questions that I didn't have answers to. So I don't remember if it was immediately after, but fairly soon afterwards I went back, and then I went back again, and many trips happened. So it organically grew into a project, and the topics became much more defined. And I think, and I realized that actually the more you read about this, the more research you do, the more people you meet, a lot of this has not been documented that much, particularly not in English. There are some journals and some sources of information in the local languages that are available, but not that much. So, and also when you meet people with all that strength and all that intensity, it's fascinating to see how people manage to react to these topics. So that's why.
But
Thank you for the talk, Kristian. This is an identity question, because I noticed that from the beginning you took a bit of distance towards the artist, the idea of art and documentary photography. I was wondering, where do you draw the line? Because there is a question of intention, of context of production, of means you use. Is it a combination of these, or what is the relation between art and the work you do?
So actually, I don't think there's that much difference, because I think that in 2018 there's many arguments that would lead to us probably mixing everything. When I teach today, I tell my students that it doesn't matter what you study. It's not that important. Maybe if you become a lawyer or a medical doctor, it's more important, but in a lot of subjects, it's not that important what you study. You need to learn to learn. You need to learn to do a project and complete the project. And you need to know how to research. That's important. Things are no longer based upon you doing typical reports in academic journals and so on. This is not where you get your information the best possible way anymore. It used to be like that years ago. So it's the same in the media world. So in the media world today, and I just yesterday had a meeting at Keystone, in fact, because they moved location in Lausanne. So I went to talk to them there, and we were discussing projects, how to produce projects the way that it can be used, because typical unless you are from very few agencies, your work doesn't necessarily automatically go in a newspaper or in a magazine. It goes in many different ways. You have to rethink how you're working. So you probably end up using more mediums than one. That's for sure. And that made me think, when I had a discussion with a professor from the Royal College of Art in London as well. If you study there, which is considered kind of the most important art school in the UK, or at least one of them, if you study there today, you're given fantastic resources and locations and this and the other, but you're not studying just painting or ceramics or photography. You studied all. And it's about acquiring all that and using it. So in a way, it's a very diffuse, vague answer, but I think it's also a diffuse, vague title, which is descriptive enough for this complex. But yeah.
I recall some work of Margaret White's and photographing the war and photographing finding coming into camps in World War II. And she seemed to be able to use the camera as a protection. So do you feel that you kind of use that also as a psychological protection because you're in such a heavy, difficult subject that you're working with?
Yeah, I didn't show the heavy pictures, but yes, I see what you mean. And I think it's to some extent true. I can totally identify with that. And I think that I often refer to being in a photography bubble. You know, you're somewhere, you talk to people. I don't have a long zoom on my camera. I use moderate wide angle and a wide angle lens. That's it. So I would like to have this kind of distance to people because I want to communicate to the people. And I think you can tell that in pictures too. That, you know, I don't try to steal a picture from somebody kind of thing. I don't even own a lens like that because I don't want to have that. So I think that's important. So yeah, when you're photographing, you're photographing. And even more so because when I was saying to Juliana, next week I'm going to photograph and film brain surgery. And I'm a wimp in a hospital. And I've done a few pictures like that. But I know if I start to feel this is not good, I just look through my camera and everything's fine.
So it is, yeah.
Yeah, it is. That's when I noticed it first. Yeah.
The thing that you said, one of the things that you said that I find really fascinating, and I think it rejoins this question of art, is you talked about how much preparation you have to do so that you prepare the inner canvas of yourself to be able to receive and understand what's going on. And then you need patience, and you are perhaps in a strategic place in terms of light and in terms of story, and then you wait for the picture to happen. And this I find fascinating because do you have a sense of confidence that the picture will happen because this is part of the thread of your thinking, or is it more founded on hope and you're just lucky a lot of the time?
I think it's what's the term again? An educated guess. You know, if you do enough research on something, you can anticipate quite well where and how and what's going to happen, you know, in what order things are going on. And many photographers I talk to, David L. Harvey is a photographer with Magnum. He uses exactly the same kind of technique. They all talk about the same thing. A friend of mine in Sarajevo, a great photographer, Paul Lowe, he's talking exactly the same kind of way because it's, if you want to tell something properly, you've got to know what you're telling, and in order to do that, you do your research. And whether it's pictures, whether it's video or texts, in the end of the day, it's just another language anyway, and it works in the same way. You have to prepare yourself in the same way, and yeah, finding the locations. Yeah, so you got to be smart about, you know, what are the tools as a photographer? You have light mostly. You have locations and compositions. You use that in the best possible way to come to that conclusion, and that is often about patience, because you're not going to stage it.
But what I find really key in what you're saying is that your participation is in the preparation.
Yes, that's important.
And you are not doing the picture. And
No, it's true. It's a the preparation. It's the key for
And
sure.
you can say that every performing musician does the same thing.
Just the same thing. In the end of
So
the
then
day,
it's art.
in the end of the day, it's many things of it's.
Freya, again? Good for you, Freya.
I wanted to ask, I understand why you chose to photograph the victims of the Rwandan genocide and the people in Bosnia, but why the hospitals?
The hospitals.
Yeah, why the brain?
It's a corporate job. It's an organization that contacted me. Would you be interested in document that? In the world of photography?
But I mean, is it linked to genocide? That's why you
Not at
picked
all.
it, or
No,
not at all?
it's linked to having to pay my bills. So. Yeah, that's it.
Would you like to do more, go into genocide?
If I want to go into genocide, I'm not sure. But to tell you the truth, I'm quite happy to do a diversity of different things, and I feel lucky that I can do that because you learn from everything that you do in life. And I think that working in a hospital or in a research laboratory or in the field where something like this has been going on, you learn from all of them. And the techniques used in one location is not necessarily the same as the other. It's a bit like biking. If you're going to bike well, you've got to practice well too. So to be able to do a bit of everything is good. A lot of the hospital laboratories and so on, a lot of that is me creating a studio everywhere. I'm not posing people as such. I'm telling them, do whatever you do and let me work around you. And then they do it. And that helps you as a photographer too. So I'm quite happy to do different things. And frankly, the days when photojournalists were only doing photojournalism are gone a long time ago. Go and check what the agency guys are doing, the larger, well-known agencies. It's a mix between what would typically traditionally be called fine art to advertising, even many of the old great classics that as a photojournalist type student would read about. They're doing, Elliot Erwitt created a pseudonym for himself to do advertising work, which is crazy. Anyway, so yeah.
One last question.
Okay. You did a lot of research into the survivors and how they feel and how they go on in life, and they had to survive not only physically but psychologically and continue with a goal in life or something. Did you find any traits that were common across the board for these survivors?
That's a good question. Common. I think many of them. I mean, oftentimes the conversations are a little bit similar, but still, people still have individual ways of dealing with things. I think one typical, maybe it's a little bit of a cliche, but I mean the key, because oftentimes is women organizations. Definitely that communal working together is definitely one common thing for sure. They help each other a lot. In all the places I worked, at least. But although many results are similar, there are also many that are not so similar because there are different reasons why this happened. And depending on how badly some of them were affected too. One was extreme. She was a sex slave with Daesh, and she has tried to escape several times. And this was an extreme situation. I don't know. She's one that I wanted to meet this summer. We had planned to go back, but I don't know if I'm not sure common would be necessarily the word I would use right away. But if there's a common, it must be someone that communal work done together for sure. And a lot of things get hidden away for sure too. I think we see this much, but there's that much.
Thank you so much, Kristian.
Thank you.
Thanks to WHA who co-sponsored this event. I wanted to just say Martina's here and a number of members of the WHA are here, so thank you.